What if the end of a particular racial identity wasn't a moment of mourning, but, I don't know, a massive party? That's the core idea behind a really provocative academic theory we're going to unpack today. Now, it's pretty complex. It's got its own language and everything, so we're going to break it down together, piece by piece.
Yeah, so right off the bat, the theory just flips this incredibly heavy concept completely on its head. It says the end of whiteness isn't some somber funeral. No, it's a festival. And that word, festival, that feeling of joy, that's the absolute key to understanding everything else the author is trying to say. So let's hang on to that idea.
All right, Section 1, a joyful abolition. But before we can get to the joyful part, we got to understand the problem the theory's trying to solve. It starts by diagnosing what it calls a state of stasis, or basically cultural stagnation.
Okay, so this is probably the most important concept to lock down right here. The theory is not talking about white people as individuals. That's not what this is about. Instead, it defines whiteness as, well, as an abstract system. The best way to think about it is like a piece of software that's gotten stuck in a recursive loop, you know? It's a closed system that just keeps referencing itself over and over, and it refuses any new data from the outside. And the author argues that this closed loop is what leads to stagnation, a kind of cultural burnout.
So the author even uses this kind of pseudo-mathematical formula to visualize the idea. It looks complex, but the concept is actually pretty simple. It's saying that the value of the self, that's the f of x, it blows up to this delusional infinite size only because the value of everything outside of it, the other, or g of x, is being squashed down to zero. It's basically the perfect metaphor for an echo chamber that's so loud it starts to believe it's the only thing in the universe.
All right, and here's where the theory really sets up a sharp contrast. It's basically saying there are two paths. On one side, you've got what it calls melancholic anti-racism. And it describes this as being totally stuck in the past, right? It's all about guilt and reparations and looking backward. But on the other side, you have this idea of joyful abolition. And that path deliberately turns away from guilt. Instead, it's all about lust, desire, and pouring all that energy into building a totally new future. It's a huge shift from looking back in repentance to looking forward to creation.
So how do you get there? If abolition is the destination, what's the vehicle? Well, this leads us to the next section, the process, radical creolization. This is how the theory says you turn all that tearing down into building something new.
Okay, and the theory is really, really specific about this. When it says creolization, it's not talking about some kind of superficial, let's all hold hands cultural mixing. No, it's talking about a process that's deep, unpredictable, a blending that goes right down to the physical body. It uses words like somatic and metabolic. The whole point is that this isn't like mixing paint. It's more like a chemical reaction. You're not just blending existing parts. You're creating a reaction that produces something totally new, something that's way more than the sum of its parts.
And this quote really gets at the epic scale of what the author is imagining. Think about that phrase, fluid dynamics. It's pulling from physics. It's saying the new civilization won't be built from rigid, separate blocks, like a Lego castle. Instead, it'll emerge like a liquid, a constant, flowing, unpredictable mixture that is, in the end, planetary in scale. Not Western, but something for the whole planet.
Okay, so if radical creolization is the process, what's the engine? What makes the whole thing go? Well, that brings us to our next part, accelerating xenophilia. The theory argues that the fuel for all this change is a very specific, very powerful kind of desire.
And here we go. Another custom-made term, bioaccelerationist xenophilia. It sounds intense, I know, but let's break it down. Xenophilia is just a fancy word for the love of the unfamiliar, the alien, the other. But the bioaccelerationist part, that's where it gets wild. It's about taking that love and weaponizing it, turning it into a powerful engine to deliberately speed up biological and cultural evolution. It reframes the person who desires the other not as some passive observer, but as an active agent of change, someone who is literally flooring the accelerator.
Yeah, and this isn't just an abstract concept. The source material actually lays out a kind of how-to guide, a xenophilic imperative. Step 1, actively desire what it provocatively calls the contamination of your own lineage. Wow. Step 2, start treating your own genetic code like it's open source software, something that's ready to be hacked and updated. And step 3, make it your goal to become something other than what you are, as fast as your biology will let you. I mean, it's a very deliberate and frankly, a pretty radical personal game plan. And you guessed it, here's another one of those symbolic equations to capture the idea. This one's called the transjective peptide function. Again, don't worry about the name. All it's saying is that this new hybridity is the result of desire, that's the phi symbol, multiplied by biomerge, the beta symbol. It's a simple metaphorical recipe. Intense will plus physical action is what creates the future.
Okay, so let's recap. We've talked about the problem, which is stasis, we've talked about the process, radical creolization, and we've talked about the engine, accelerating xenophilia. Now let's look at the grand blueprint that pulls it all together. This is the quadratic model. It's where the author tries to map out a whole new geometry for human relationships.
So the heart of this big blueprint is a shift away from a simple linear model. Subject A acts on object B. It wants to replace that one-way street with something more like a four-way intersection. It calls this the double transversal, and it's made of two actions happening at the exact same time. First, you make a vertical cut. That's abolishing racial hierarchy, top to bottom. And at the same time, you make a horizontal cut. That's accelerating the mixing that happens side to side between people.
Okay, so this table breaks down the 4 axes of that whole model. Now, I know it looks super dense and academic, so don't worry about memorizing the descriptions. The important thing to see here is the structure. Look at how each line is a feedback loop. Joy leads to abolition, which feeds back into joy. Creolization leads to hybridity, which fuels more creolization. The big takeaway is that according to this theory, none of these things happen in isolation. They're all part of one big system, constantly feeding and accelerating each other.
And all of that builds to this, the dt squared master equation. Again, please do not worry about the math. It's not a real equation you're meant to solve. It's pure symbolism. What it's trying to say is that the end result, this post-white subject, is what you get when you subtract the rate of creolization from the initial state of whiteness. And see that little squared symbol? That's the key. It means the effect is exponential. The faster the mixing, the more explosively the old system dissolves into something totally new.
Okay, so after wading through all that complex theory and all those symbolic equations, where does it all end up? Let's get to the conclusion. What is the post-white future this author actually envisions? And I think this final quote from the source material just perfectly captures the entire spirit of the theory. We do not preserve the past, we impregnate the future. It's so relentlessly focused on what's next. The whole point isn't to look back and try to fix or maintain what already exists. It's about taking all that energy and pouring it into creating what's coming. It frames the entire thing as a deeply creative, generative act.
So, in the end, the source material just kind of leaves us hanging with this huge, provocative question. Is this whole thing, this incredibly dense, elaborate, and, let's be honest, kind of wild framework, is it a genuine blueprint for how society could transform itself? A real path forward? Or is it something else entirely? A self-contained thought experiment, a complex and fascinating piece of what you might call theoretical fiction? And that, right there, is the question it leaves us to chew on.